I never believed my own daughter Laura would be the one to cast me aside when I needed her most. I never imagined the man she married, Mark, would delight in breaking me down to my very core, and that she would simply watch it happen in silence. But in their cruelty, they overlooked one critical detail. A hidden truth from my past was waiting to be discovered. And when I finally uncovered it, their carefully constructed world came crashing down. Get ready, because this isn't just a story of betrayal. It's the story of how I took back everything. My name is Helen, and I am 61 years old. Until 6 months ago, I believed I understood the architecture of love, especially the kind that exists between a mother and her child. I thought it was a structure built of unconditional support, a fortress that could withstand any storm. I spent my life laying every brick, mixing every batch of mortar, all for my husband, Robert, and our daughter, Laura. Every pancake I flipped on a Sunday morning, every dollar we tucked away for her college fund, every sleepless night I spent worrying when she was sick, it was all for her. My world was a small, fiercely protected kingdom, and she was its heart. When Robert died from a sudden heart attack last spring, the kingdom crumbled. The silence he left behind was a physical presence, a cold draft that seeped through the floorboards of the house we had built together in the quiet suburbs of Chicago. It was a house that had echoed with his booming laughter and the scent of the wood varnish he used for his little projects in the garage. After he was gone, those echoes became ghosts. I would wake in the middle of the night, certain I had heard him calling my name, only to be met with the suffocating stillness of our empty bed. Selling the house was like performing an amputation on my own soul, but staying was unthinkable. Each room held a memory too sharp to touch. It was Laura who suggested it first. "Mom, why don't you come stay with us for a while, just until you get back on your feet?" Her voice over the phone was laced with the concerned, gentle tone she had always used when she was a little girl, trying to comfort me. Her husband, Mark, was a successful financial analyst, and they lived in a sleek, modern apartment downtown with a view of the city skyline. At the time, it felt like a lifeline, a place to grieve without being entirely alone. When I arrived with my 2 suitcases and a box of Robert's old books, Laura hugged me tightly at the door. Mark, however, barely glanced up from his tablet, offering only a cursory grunt that I was meant to interpret as a welcome. I tried not to be a burden. I made myself as small and quiet as possible, a ghost of a different kind in their minimalist, gray and white world. I rose before they did, making coffee just the way Mark liked it, strong and black. I did their laundry, folding his crisp work shirts with a precision I hadn't used in years. I cooked elaborate dinners, filling the apartment with the aromas of the dishes Laura had grown up loving, hoping to somehow remind her of the family we once were. I was trying to pay my rent in service, in quiet, unobtrusive care. I wanted to be helpful, but more than that, I wanted to be invisible. I learned the rhythm of their lives and did my best to exist only in the silent spaces between the beats. But for Mark, my presence was an unavoidable, irritating noise. His displeasure was never in loud pronouncements, but in 1,000 tiny, calculated cruelties. It was the way his eyes would skim past me, as if I were a piece of furniture he found distasteful. It was the heavy, theatrical sigh he would let out whenever I entered the living room while he was watching television. He had a habit of putting on expensive noise-canceling headphones the moment I tried to start a conversation, creating a literal wall of sound between us. Once, I was in my room, the door slightly ajar, and I overheard him on the phone with one of his friends. "I don't know, man," he'd said, his voice dripping with condescension. "It's like living with a permanent houseguest who doesn't know when the party's over." The words landed like tiny shards of glass in my heart. I would search Laura's face for backup, for a glimmer of the fierce, protective daughter I had raised. But she had become a master of avoidance. When Mark would make a dismissive comment about the way I organized the pantry or the brand of olive oil I bought, she would just offer a strained, placating smile. "Oh, Mark," she'd say lightly. "Be nice." Then she would quickly change the subject. If I ever tried to talk to her about it in private, she would retreat behind a wall of excuses. "He's just under a lot of pressure at the firm, Mom," she'd insist, her eyes refusing to meet mine. "He doesn't mean it. You just have to get to know him." But I knew him. I saw the cold satisfaction in his eyes when he made me feel small. I swallowed the hurt and the shame, telling myself this was temporary. I told myself that this was what mothers did. We endure the discomfort of our children's choices for the sake of peace. We absorb the blows so that they don't have to. The breaking point arrived on a cold Friday night in November. The air in the apartment was already thick with a tension that had been building for weeks. I had decided to cook a special meal, a slow-cooked pot roast, the kind Robert used to make for celebratory dinners. I thought, foolishly, that a taste of the past might soften the hard edges of the present. We sat at their polished concrete dining table, the silence broken only by the clinking of silverware against ceramic plates. Laura was pushing a lone carrot around her plate with her fork, her gaze distant. Mark was sipping his second glass of expensive whiskey, his eyes cold and assessing. He hadn't said a single word about the meal I had spent all afternoon preparing. Then, out of nowhere, he set his glass down with a definitive click. "Helen," he said. The use of my first name was a deliberate, calculated sting. He never called me Mom. "I think it's time we discussed the long-term plan here." I looked at him, my fork hovering over my plate. "What do you mean, Mark?" His lips curved into a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "I mean this whole arrangement. It was meant to be temporary. It's been 3 months. We're not running a retirement home. Our finances are carefully planned. And frankly, we didn't budget for a dependent." The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. A dependent. My breath caught in my throat. My heart began to pound a frantic, painful rhythm against my ribs. I felt the blood drain from my face. I slowly turned my gaze to my daughter, my last line of defense, my fortress. Her name was a silent scream in my mind. "Laura, say something, please." But she wouldn't look at me. Her eyes were glued to the half-eaten carrot on her plate, as if it were the most fascinating thing in the world. Then, she let out a quiet, shaky breath and whispered the words that would shatter my world. "Mom, maybe Mark has a point. It's become a strain on everyone." A strain. That was the word she chose for my grief, for my presence, for my love. I wasn't her mother anymore. I was a problem to be solved, a weight to be shed. In that moment, the fight drained out of me, replaced by a cold, hollow calm. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I had given them my entire life, and it wasn't enough. There was nothing left to say. I slowly placed my knife and fork on the table, carefully folded my cloth napkin, and placed it beside my plate. "I understand," I said, and my voice was unnervingly steady. I stood up from the table and walked to the small guest room at the back of the apartment. I moved with a strange, detached precision, pulling my 2 suitcases from the top of the closet. I packed my clothes, the few photos of Robert I kept on the nightstand, and the small collection of books I had brought with me. Every folded sweater, every zipped bag was a final, silent goodbye to the life I thought I had. That's all I had left of 61 years. 2 suitcases. Laura never came to the room. She never offered a word, a touch, a tear. Through the wall, I could hear the low murmur of the television. Mark had already moved on, engrossed in a basketball game. I rolled my suitcases into the living room. He didn't even turn around. I didn't look at Laura. I couldn't. I walked to the door, opened it, and stepped out into the hallway without a single look back. The tears didn't come as I waited for the elevator. They didn't come as I walked through the sterile, brightly lit lobby. The emotional dam finally broke when I was standing on the curb outside their gleaming, impersonal building, the biting November wind whipping through my thin coat. I stood there for an hour, my suitcases standing beside me like two lonely soldiers, and realized with a terrifying clarity that I had absolutely nowhere to go. I had been erased. That night, I used the last of my emergency cash to check into a dingy hotel on the far edge of the city, the kind where the wallpaper was peeling in damp strips and the air smelled faintly of bleach and regret. I lay awake all night, staring at the water-stained ceiling, listening to the hum of the ice machine in the hall, and I replayed my daughter's whisper in my head over and over until the words lost all meaning. A strain on everyone. The first few days in that soulless hotel room bled into one another, a watercolor wash of gray misery. The room had a permanent, cloying smell of chemical air freshener, failing to mask decades of cigarette smoke and quiet desperation. The constant hum of the highway outside my window became a lullaby of defeat, a reminder that the rest of the world was still moving forward while my own had ground to a halt. I didn't cry constantly, but when the tears came, they were silent and convulsive, the kind of weeping that shakes your entire body but makes no sound, because you know with a bone-deep certainty that no one is coming to comfort you. On the third day, my thumb hovered over Laura's contact in my phone. I typed and deleted a dozen messages, each one angrier or more pathetic than the last. In the end, I settled on something simple, something a mother would say. "I'm safe. Hope you are well." I stared at the screen for an hour, waiting for the three little dots that would signify a reply, but they never appeared. The message remained there, delivered but unanswered, a tiny monument to my own irrelevance. A week later, I tried again, thinking of you. This time, the silence that followed felt heavier, more intentional. I tried to build excuses for her in my mind. Mark must have forbidden her from talking to me. She must be scared, conflicted. But as the weeks crawled by, that fragile hope began to fester, turning into a bitter rot in the pit of my stomach. My savings, the modest amount I'd kept after selling the house, were thinning at an alarming rate. The reality of my situation began to set in. I was 61 years old, a widow with a gap in my resume that spanned 3 decades. I started applying for jobs, anything that would keep me from having to dip further into the principal from the house sale. A receptionist at a dentist's office, a cashier at a grocery store, even a hostess at a chain restaurant down the road. The rejections were always polite, cloaked in corporate jargon like overqualified or not the right fit, which I soon learned were just kinder ways of saying too old, too slow, too sad. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest until it was hard to breathe. I had given my entire adult life to raising a daughter who now considered me a strain, and in doing so, I had erased any value I might have had to the outside world. One evening, unable to bear the static from the old television or the suffocating silence of my own thoughts, I pulled out the single cardboard box I'd brought with me that wasn't filled with clothes. It was a memory box, a dusty collection of relics from the life I used to have. There were a few faded photographs of Robert and me on our honeymoon, a handful of Laura's childhood drawings, and tucked at the very bottom, wrapped in cheesecloth, was a small, cloth-bound book. It was my mother Evelyn's diary. I stared at it, surprised. I had no memory of packing it. It must have been an unconscious act, a desperate reach for something solid in the chaos of my departure. I almost put it back, but the worn, soft texture of the fabric under my fingers made me pause. I sat on the edge of the lumpy motel bed, the light from the single lamp casting long shadows across the room, and opened the first page. Her handwriting was exactly as I remembered from the notes she used to slip into my school lunchbox, neat, elegant, and always in a deep blue ink. The first several entries were ordinary, a chronicle of a quiet life. She wrote about the progress of her rose bushes, complaints about the rising price of milk, and notes from her weekly church service. It was the comforting, predictable rhythm of my mother's world. But then, as I flipped further, I landed on an entry dated in the spring of the year before I was born. My breath caught in my chest. AWP visited today. He held my hand in the little cafe by the river and told me he wished the world were a different place. A place where he could be my husband, where our child could carry his name. But he has his legacy to consider, his family. A name that is practically royalty in this city. Little Helen must never know the truth of her birth. She must only know that she is loved, fiercely and completely. Even if she was born from a secret, she was not a mistake. I read the passage twice, then a third time, the words blurring through a sudden film of tears. Little Helen must never know. I frantically flipped through the pages, my heart hammering against my ribs. Entry after entry now seemed to hold a double meaning. She never named him in full, only ever using the initials AWP. There were mentions of clandestine meetings in downtown hotel lobbies, small envelopes of cash she tried to refuse but needed to pay the rent, and a deep, abiding sadness that a life together was impossible. Then I found another entry, dated a few years later, that made me stop breathing altogether. He said he has made a promise to me. Should anything ever happen to him, he has made provisions for Helen's future. It cannot be in a will, of course. The risk would be too great for his other family. But he spoke of a private trust, an arrangement handled by his most trusted friend and confidant. A man who would know what to do if I ever reached out. His lawyer, Mr. Abrams. Abrams. The name hit me like a physical blow. It felt important, solid, real. My hands were trembling so violently I could barely function. Forgetting all my earlier fears of being seen, I rushed down to the hotel's sad little business center, which consisted of a single, ancient desktop computer in the lobby. The keyboard was sticky, and the internet connection was painfully slow, but I typed the name into the search bar. Lawyer David Abrams, Chicago. The result came up instantly. David Abrams, Senior Partner Emeritus, at a prestigious law firm downtown. His profile picture showed a kind-faced man with laugh lines around his eyes, now semi-retired but still listed as a consultant for complex estate law. I stared at his phone number, but the thought of calling him, of trying to explain this insane story to a stranger, was paralyzing. What if he thought I was a fraud? What if my mother had been delusional? Instead, I walked to a nearby convenience store, bought a single sheet of paper, an envelope, and a stamp. Back in my room, I sat and wrote a letter. My handwriting was shaky and uneven, but I poured out the story, explaining who I was, who my mother Evelyn was, and I quoted the lines from her diary. I didn't ask for money. I just begged for a conversation, for a chance to understand. 3 agonizing weeks passed. Every day that went by, the sliver of hope the diary had given me dwindled. I began to believe I had imagined it all. A fantasy, cooked up by a lonely, grieving mind. I had started rationing my meals, my funds now dangerously low. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, my cheap, prepaid phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. Hello? An elderly, refined voice on the other end spoke. Am I speaking with Miss Helen? Yes. This is she, I said, my heart starting to flutter. My name is David Abrams. I received your letter. There was a pause, and I could hear him take a deep breath. I held my own, waiting. I must admit, I have been waiting for this call for over 30 years. When you mentioned your mother's name, Evelyn, I knew it was finally time. His voice was thick with an emotion I couldn't quite place. Your father, Arthur William Prescott. He left something in my care for you. I think it's time you came to see it. The morning after Mr. Abrams' call, I took a train to the city center. The ticket cost me $7, a significant portion of the cash I had left, and the entire journey felt dreamlike and unreal. My suitcase was packed and stored at the hotel's front desk, a silent testament to a desperate hope that I might not have to return to that place of shame. As the train rattled along the tracks, I stared out at the Chicago skyline, a collection of glass and steel giants that seemed to pierce the gray morning sky. I had lived in the shadow of this city my entire life, yet I had never felt smaller or more disconnected from its world of power and wealth. For all I knew, one of those gleaming towers bore the Prescott name, and the irony of it, my name, the one I never knew I had a right to, was a bitter pill to swallow. The law firm of Abrams, Finch, and Holloway was located in a historic building on LaSalle Street, a place that smelled of old money and quiet importance. The lobby was a cathedral of marble and polished brass, and I felt my shabby coat and worn-out shoes were a sacrilege in such a space. My heart hammered against my ribs as the elevator ascended silently to the 42nd floor. I walked into the firm's reception area, a hushed world of dark mahogany, leather-bound books, and thick oriental rugs that muffled every footstep. When I gave my name to the receptionist, she gave me a warm, respectful smile that was so foreign it almost made me flinch. A moment later, David Abrams emerged from a set of double doors. He was older than his photograph suggested, perhaps in his late 80s, but he moved with a gentle energy, his eyes crinkling at the corners with the same kindness I had seen online. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored tweed jacket and exuded an air of calm authority. "Miss Helen," he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm and reassuring. "Please come in. I've been expecting you." He led me into his corner office, a magnificent room with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city below. The walls were lined with thousands of books, and the air smelled of old paper, leather, and brewing tea. He gestured for me to sit in a plush leather armchair opposite his enormous wooden desk. He didn't begin with business. Instead, he asked about my journey, offered me a cup of tea, and then he spoke about my mother. "I knew your mother, Evelyn, for many years," he said softly, his gaze distant with memory. "Not just as a client's associate, but as a friend. She was a woman of incredible grace and strength. She loved you more than anything in this world, Helen. Everything she did, every difficult choice she made, was to protect you." Hearing him speak of her with such genuine affection brought a lump to my throat. For the first time in months, I felt a connection to someone, a sense of being seen not as a burden, but as Evelyn's daughter. After a few more minutes of quiet conversation, his expression grew more serious. He reached into a drawer of his desk and retrieved a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was sealed with wax and yellowed with age, looking as if it had been stored away for half a century. Written across the front, in a strong, decisive script, were words that made my hands begin to tremble. "For my daughter, Helen. Arthur wrote this for you the year before he passed away." Mr. Abrams explained gently. His instructions were clear. I was to give it to you only if you sought me out. He wanted the choice to be yours. He slid the envelope across the polished surface of the desk. It felt as heavy as a gravestone. With fumbling fingers, I broke the seal. The letter inside was written on heavy, expensive stationery. The ink slightly faded, but still perfectly legible. The words were not those of a stranger, but of a father filled with a lifetime of regret. "My dearest Helen," it began. "If you are reading this, it means that life has led you to a truth I was too much of a coward to tell you myself. I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, only for your understanding. I loved your mother, Evelyn, with a depth of feeling I never knew before or since. But I was a man trapped by duty, by a name, and by another family. To bring you into my world would have destroyed them and cast a shadow over you for your entire life. And so, I made the most difficult decision of all: to love you from a distance, to watch you grow through the letters and photographs your mother would send me, my heart aching with a pride I could never voice. I had to pause, my vision blurring with tears. I looked up at Mr. Abrams, who simply nodded, giving me the space to process. I continued reading. I know that money is a cold comfort for the absence of a father. It cannot replace the birthdays I missed, the scraped knees I couldn't comfort, or the graduation I couldn't attend. But it is the only language of love my world allowed me to speak. I made a promise to your mother that you would never want for anything, that you would always be secure. In the event of my death, I have left a portion of my personal assets entirely separate and untraceable from my official estate in the care of David Abrams. He is the only other soul on this earth who knows the truth. You are my blood, Helen, and though I failed to claim you in life, I claim you now, with all my heart, in death. Be happy. Be strong. You are a Prescott. I folded the letter, my chest tight with a storm of emotions: sorrow for the father I never knew, anger at the life that was kept from me, and a profound, overwhelming sense of validation. I was not an accident. I was loved. As I sat there, stunned into silence, Mr. Abrams gently pushed a thick, dark green leather-bound folder across the desk towards me. These were his final instructions, he said softly. Everything has been managed in a private trust for the last 30 years, growing, waiting for you. I opened the folder. The first page was a summary sheet. Inside were official documents, statements, and deeds. There were several private bank accounts, a robust portfolio of blue-chip stocks and bonds, and, to my utter astonishment, the ownership deeds to 3 commercial properties in the city. My eyes scanned the columns of numbers, but my brain couldn't quite comprehend them. They were just figures on a page, abstract and meaningless, until my gaze fell upon the final line at the bottom of the summary sheet, under the heading Total Estimated Value, a little over $15 million. I stared at the number, then at Mr. Abrams, then back at the number. I didn't gasp. I didn't laugh or break down into sobs. A strange, quiet calm settled over me. It wasn't the money that electrified my soul. It was the truth behind it. For the first time in my life, I felt chosen. After months of feeling like discarded trash, like a burden, like a strain on everyone, this folder in my hands was telling me a different story. It told me that I mattered, that I had worth, that I was the daughter of a man who, despite his flaws, had tried to honor me in the only way he knew how. This is real, I whispered, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. Mr. Abrams nodded, his eyes kind. It has always been yours, Helen. Always. I don't remember leaving his office or the ride back to the hotel. I refused his offer of a car service, instead hailing a taxi myself, the first small, decisive act of my new life. I walked back into the same dingy hotel room, but it was as if I were seeing it with new eyes. The peeling wallpaper, the stained carpet, the humming ice machine, they were no longer symbols of my failure. They were artifacts of a life that was now officially over. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay on the lumpy bed and stared at the water-stained ceiling, just as I had for weeks. But this time, there was no despair. This time, a slow, cold smile crept across my face in the darkness. Laura and Mark thought they had discarded me. They thought I was finished. A sad old woman with 2 suitcases and a broken heart. They had no idea. I wasn't broken. The shame that had been my constant companion was burning away, and in its place was a feeling I hadn't felt in a very long time: power. Quiet, firm, and entirely mine. I was just getting started. I didn't leave that hotel immediately. For 3 more days, I stayed in that room of peeling wallpaper and stale air, not out of necessity, but as a deliberate act of transition. It was my chrysalis. I sat in the quiet, letting the shock of my inheritance settle, allowing the grief and shame that had defined me for months to burn away, leaving behind something harder and more resilient. The woman who had checked into this hotel was a victim, adrift and erased. The woman who would check out would be someone entirely different. On the fourth day, I walked out of that hotel for the last time, leaving the ghost of my old self behind in that water-stained room. With Mr. Abrams' discreet assistance, my first move wasn't to buy a mansion or a luxury car. It was to secure a short-term lease on a modern, furnished corporate apartment in a quiet, upscale neighborhood. It was the kind of place that was intentionally forgettable, with clean lines, neutral colors, and an air of sterile anonymity. It was the perfect headquarters. From there, I began my real education. I didn't waste time on shopping sprees or lavish meals. Instead, I invested in myself. I bought a high-end laptop, and for weeks, I did nothing but study. I subscribed to the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times. I enrolled in online courses on commercial real estate management, contract law, and corporate structuring. I devoured books on investment strategy. I was learning the language of power, the vocabulary of the world that Mark inhabited and used as a weapon. My goal wasn't to build an empire, it was to build an impenetrable fortress around myself. I made a silent vow. I would never be powerless again. It was during one of these late-night study sessions, while I was scrolling through city databases of distressed properties for my coursework, that I found it. The listing was buried on a municipal auction site, almost hidden between foreclosed warehouses and abandoned lots. It was for a 30-unit apartment building, described as structurally sound but in default on several years of property taxes. My heart, which had been steady and calm for weeks, suddenly began to pound against my ribs. I knew the address. I knew the red brick facade and the slightly crooked awning over the front door. It was the building where Laura and Mark lived, the building where my life had ended, and a new, terrible one had begun. It felt like fate, cold and sharp, had just handed me a loaded gun. The idea that bloomed in my mind was not born of rage, but of a chilling, crystalline clarity. This was not just an opportunity for revenge. It was a chance for a kind of poetic, karmic justice that no amount of shouting or confrontation could ever achieve. The next morning, I was on the phone with Mr. Abrams. My voice was calm and measured as I laid out the plan. He listened patiently, and I could almost hear the smile in his voice when I finished. He saw the same elegant, inescapable logic that I did. Within 48 hours, he had established a new, anonymous LLC for me, a shell company with a name that no one could ever trace back to me. We called it E.H. Holdings, for Evelyn and Helen, a quiet tribute to the legacy of hidden strength my mother had passed down to me. The process was shockingly simple. With Mr. Abrams' firm handling the paperwork, the funds were transferred from my trust into the holding company's account. The bid was placed electronically during the online auction, a sterile and impersonal process that lasted less than 10 minutes. I sat in my quiet, sunlit apartment, sipping a cup of tea, and watched a small green banner flash on my screen. Sold. Just like that, I had won. For a price that was a mere fraction of my newfound wealth, I became the legal owner of the building where my daughter and son-in-law slept, where they ate their meals, and where they had callously dismissed me as a burden. I was now their landlord. A month went by, a period of quiet, meticulous planning as the ownership was legally transferred and the new management protocols were put in place. Then, it was time. The letters, printed on crisp, professional letterhead bearing the E.H. Holdings logo, were sent out to every tenant. The notice was standard: a formal introduction to the new ownership, and a notification that all lease agreements would be subject to review and reassessment to align with current market standards. It was professional, boring, and would likely cause nothing more than a few grumbles from the other tenants. The letter addressed to Mr. Mark and Mrs. Laura Harmon, apartment 4B, was different. It began with the same corporate language, but it contained one additional, crucial paragraph. It informed them that, following a comprehensive market rate analysis for their specific unit, their new monthly rent would be increased to an amount that was precisely triple their current rate. The increase was non-negotiable and would take effect in 60 days. The language was cold, airtight, and offered no room for argument. I didn't need to be there to see the explosion. I could practically feel the shockwave of Mark's impotent fury from across the city. He was a man whose entire identity was built on a foundation of control. Control over his finances, his career, his home, and especially his wife. I had just reached into the very heart of his world and, silently and invisibly, taken that control away from him. 2 days later, my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a name I had not seen in months. Laura. For a single agonizing moment, my old heart, the mother's heart, seized in my chest. A part of me wanted to answer, to hear her voice, to offer a comfort that was as instinctual as breathing. But the woman I had become, the woman who had spent weeks in a cold hotel room replaying a single, whispered betrayal, simply watched the screen until the ringing stopped. A minute later, a notification appeared. New voicemail. I listened to it with a detached curiosity. Her voice was thin, high-pitched, with a panic she was failing to conceal. Mom? Hi, it's me. Listen, I don't know if you've heard, but something really, really strange is happening with our apartment. The building was sold to some company, and, Mom, they've tripled our rent. I mean, it's an insane amount. Mark is he's losing his mind. He's been yelling for 2 days straight. I didn't know who else to talk to. Can you please call me back? I listened to the message a second time, analyzing it not as a mother, but as a strategist. I heard the fear, the confusion, but I also heard the familiar pattern. When things got hard, she ran, not to face the man causing the problem, but to the mother she had thrown away. I pressed the delete button. This was not about cruelty. This was about consequence. It was a lesson in gravity. They had pushed me out of their world, and now they needed to feel the full, crushing weight of its orbit without me. Late that week, I drove my new, unassuming sedan and parked on a quiet side street with a clear view of their building. I watched as the light in their 4th-floor window flickered on. I could see their silhouettes moving behind the blinds, one pacing frantically, the other standing still. I didn't need to hear the words to know the script. The blame, the accusations, the fear. A part of me, a deep, maternal part, ached for the daughter I still loved, trapped in that box of panic with the man she had chosen over me. But the larger part of me, the woman who remembered the biting wind on the curb and the profound loneliness of being erased, sat calmly in the driver's seat. Justice, I was learning, was not a loud, fiery explosion. It was the quiet, deliberate turning of a key in a lock. And I was just getting started. I always believed that true revenge wasn't about a single, fiery explosion. It was about the slow, steady application of pressure until the things that seemed strong revealed their hidden fractures. My mornings now began not with grief, but with purpose. I would sit at the small desk in my apartment, a cup of black coffee in hand, and review the daily reports from the property management company I'd hired. The reports were a fascinating window into the world I now controlled. Most entries were mundane: a leaky faucet in 2A, a request for parking passes from the family in 5C. But the entries concerning apartment 4B were becoming a chronicle of a man's unraveling. Mark's emails to the property manager, which were all forwarded to me, were escalating from indignant to unhinged. He accused the new, faceless ownership of predatory practices, of extortion, of violating a dozen non-existent housing laws. He demanded to know the name of the person behind E.H. Holdings. I read his tirades, filled with typos and empty legal threats, with a kind of clinical detachment. I knew his type. He was a man whose arrogance was a thin shell, protecting a deeply insecure core. The idea that someone, somewhere, had outmaneuvered him was an intolerable insult to his ego. He wasn't going to move out. To him, that would be admitting defeat. So he dug in his heels, his rage simmering, and I knew his pride would ultimately be the architect of his own ruin. While he was busy composing furious emails, I was authorizing improvements. I approved a budget to replace the aging, flickering lights in the hallways with bright, energy-efficient LEDs. I had new high-definition security cameras installed in the lobby and parking areas. I even hired a landscaping company to plant new flower beds out front. The beautiful irony, of course, was that Mark's tripled rent was directly funding these upgrades. His own bitterness was paying to make life better and safer for every other tenant in the building. He was so consumed by his own perceived victimhood that he couldn't see the beautiful new hydrangeas being planted right outside his window. I had new, elegant signage installed near the main entrance. The Prescott Arms, proudly managed by E.H. Holdings. It was a quiet, constant reminder of the power he could not see. One afternoon, I found myself in a high-end grocery store near my new apartment, the kind of place with artisanal cheeses and organic produce that I never would have allowed myself to shop at before. As I was examining a display of imported olive oils, I saw her. Laura was standing 2 aisles away, staring at the freezer case. She looked diminished. That was the only word for it. The vibrant energy she once had was gone, replaced by a weary exhaustion that seemed to settle in the slump of her shoulders. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her hair was tied back in a messy bun. Her shopping cart was nearly empty, containing only a few generic brand essentials: a loaf of bread, a carton of eggs, a bag of pasta. I watched, frozen in place, as she reached in and picked up a small pint of premium gelato, a specific brand of pistachio she had adored since she was a teenager. She held it for a long moment, her thumb tracing the lid. She glanced at her phone, her expression falling even further. With a quiet, defeated sigh, she placed the gelato back in the freezer and pushed her sad little cart away. That single, tiny gesture broke a piece of my heart. It wasn't pity I felt, but a sharp, piercing sorrow. I remembered all the times I had bought her that exact gelato to celebrate a good grade or soothe a broken heart. Now, the man she had chosen had squeezed their finances so tightly that this small $10 comfort was an unaffordable luxury. He was not just costing them money, he was systematically draining the small joys from her life. About a week later, I had a brief in-person meeting with the property manager in the building's small administrative office. I dressed carefully for the occasion in a tailored navy blue coat, sleek leather boots, and had my hair styled in a way that was both professional and elegant. As I was exiting the building, my briefcase in hand, I saw them walking across the parking lot. Mark was gesturing angrily, his voice a low, guttural rant about some new injustice. Laura trailed a step behind him, her head down, clutching her purse like a shield. I walked right past them, my gaze fixed straight ahead. Mark's eyes scanned over me for a split second with zero recognition. To him, I was just another anonymous, well-dressed woman. He couldn't see me because he was still looking for the sad, pliable mother-in-law he thought he had crushed. That woman was gone, and he was too blind to even notice her ghost. The final turn of the screw came a few days later. I authorized the mandatory annual safety inspections for every unit, a standard procedure outlined in the lease agreements. The formal notices were posted. As expected, the response from apartment 4B was forwarded to my inbox within hours. It was a furious, all-caps email from Mark, threatening lawsuits and calling the inspections a form of harassment. I read it, took a calm sip of my tea, and sent a one-line reply to my manager. Please proceed as scheduled and document any instances of non-compliance. The pressure, it seemed, was finally reaching its breaking point. 2 nights later, just as I was settling down to read, the intercom in my apartment buzzed. My heart skipped a beat. A small, tinny voice, barely a whisper, came through the speaker. Hello. It's Laura Harmon. I was wondering if my mom, Helen, is here. I stood frozen for a long moment, my hand hovering over the button. Then, with a deep breath, I pressed the door release. She looked like a wraith when I opened my apartment door. She was pale and thinner than I'd ever seen her, the rumpled state of her blouse suggesting she'd been wearing it for days. We stood in silence, the chasm of the last few months yawning between us in my doorway. Finally, I stepped aside. She walked in hesitantly, her eyes wide as she took in my living room, a space that was larger, brighter, and more peaceful than the cramped apartment she shared with her husband. I didn't offer pleasantries. I simply prepared 2 mugs of chamomile tea, handed one to her, and sat in the armchair opposite the sofa where she had perched on the very edge. I waited. I knew this was her meeting, her plea. She had to be the one to break the silence. He's not well, Mom, she finally said, her voice trembling as she stared into her mug. He's angry all the time now. About the rent, about his job, about everything. He blames me. He says I should have known this was going to happen. I remained silent, letting her words hang in the air. I thought I was doing the right thing, she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. That night, I just wanted to keep the peace. I didn't want him to be angry. My voice, when it came, was quiet, but as sharp as a shard of glass. You chose his peace over my dignity. She flinched as if I had struck her. She had no reply. There was none. We sat in that heavy silence for what felt like an hour. She didn't ask for money. She didn't ask for me to intervene. It seemed she just wanted to sit in a room where someone wasn't yelling at her. When she finally stood to leave, her teacup untouched, she paused at the door. I'm sorry, she whispered, the words so quiet I almost missed them. I miss you. I didn't say it back. I didn't tell her it was okay. I simply met her gaze, my expression unreadable. She held my gaze for a moment, perhaps searching for the unconditional softness she had always taken for granted, but she didn't find it. With a final, broken look, she turned and walked out, the door clicking softly shut behind her. I stood there for a long time, the warmth of my own teacup, doing little to stop the chill that had settled deep in my bones. She had come. She had cracked. But I knew this reckoning was far from over. A week after Laura's tentative visit, I knew the time for quiet observation was over. The board was set, the pieces were in place, and it was time for the final move checkmate. I instructed the property management company to schedule a mandatory tenant meeting in the building's common room for the following Tuesday evening. The official purpose stated on the notice was to discuss the timeline for significant building-wide renovations and to allow residents to meet the new ownership. I knew Mark wouldn't be able to resist. His obsession with unmasking the faceless entity that had usurped his sense of control would compel him to attend. He was walking into the lion's den, convinced he was the hunter. On the day of the meeting, I arrived early. I had chosen my armor for this battle with meticulous care, a simple but impeccably tailored charcoal gray pantsuit, a silk blouse, and low heels that made no sound on the tiled floor. My hair was styled in a sleek, professional bob, and the only jewelry I wore was a simple pair of pearl earrings. I looked nothing like the grieving widow who had cooked pot roasts in apartment 4B. I looked like a woman who owned things. I took a seat in the back corner of the sparsely decorated common room, a silent observer as the other tenants began to trickle in, most looking bored or mildly annoyed at the mandatory attendance. Then they arrived. Mark didn't walk in. He stormed in, radiating an aura of aggressive indignation. He immediately marched up to the property manager, a calm, unflappable man named Mr. Harris. "Is the owner here yet?" he demanded, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "I've been leaving messages for weeks. I want some answers. Tonight." Laura trailed behind him, a pale shadow in his turbulent wake. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, and she seemed to shrink with every step, trying to make herself invisible. Neither of them even glanced in my direction. I was, as I had been for months, completely beneath their notice. Mr. Harris, true to his professional training, remained calm. "All questions will be addressed during the presentation, sir," he said evenly. The meeting began. He clicked through a generic slideshow detailing the upcoming upgrades, the new thermal pane windows to be installed, the improved plumbing, the upgraded electrical in every unit. With each slide, I watched Mark's face grow tighter, his complexion turning a blotchy red. The knowledge that his own exorbitant rent was funding these improvements for his neighbors was clearly a poison he was being forced to swallow. He thought he was being punished, but in reality, his payments were helping to build a better community around him, a community he was no longer truly a part of. Finally, Mr. Harris arrived at the last slide. "We'd like to thank you for your cooperation as we begin this new chapter for the Prescott Arms. To answer any final questions, the owner of EH Holdings is here with us this evening." He gestured vaguely toward the back of the room. A quiet murmur went through the crowd. I stood up. Time seemed to slow down as I walked with calm, deliberate steps toward the front. A ripple of confusion spread through the room as people turned to look at me. I kept my eyes forward until I reached the small podium. I saw the precise moment Mark's brain processed who I was. His jaw went slack, his eyes widening in comical disbelief. The arrogant fury on his face dissolved into a mask of pure, stunned confusion. Beside him, Laura simply froze, her face draining of all color as her hand flew to her mouth in a silent gasp. I turned to face the small audience. "Good evening," I said, my voice resonating clearly in the quiet room. It was steady, strong, and utterly unrecognizable as the voice of the woman who had once pleaded with her eyes for mercy at their dinner table. "My name is Helen. I am the owner of this building." You could have heard a pin drop. The silence was absolute, thick with shock. It was Mark who shattered it. "You!" he bellowed, lurching to his feet so quickly that his chair screeched backward on the floor. "This is a joke. This has to be a sick joke. What kind of game are you playing?" I turned my gaze to him, really looking at him for the first time. I didn't see the intimidating monster who had broken me. I saw a small, panicked man, sweat beading on his upper lip, his cheap suit suddenly looking ill-fitting. The illusion of his power was gone. "It's no game, Mark," I said softly, my voice devoid of emotion. "It's just business." He took a menacing step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "You've been behind this the whole time. You manipulated this whole situation just to raise our rent. You're trying to ruin us." His voice was cracking with a desperate rage. "I raised your rent to reflect its market value, something that hadn't been done in years," I stated, keeping my voice level and addressing the entire room, not just him. "I used that income to make improvements that benefit every single person who lives here. I have treated every tenant equally and professionally. The only thing I didn't do, Mark, was forget the night you looked me in the eye and told me I was nothing more than an extra mouth to feed." He opened his mouth, a furious retort ready on his lips, but another voice cut through the air, a voice that was trembling but shockingly clear. "Mark, stop!" It was Laura. She was on her feet now, her eyes, for the first time, flashing with something other than fear. He turned on her, his face a mask of shocked fury. "What did you just say to me?" he hissed. "I said stop," she repeated, her voice gaining strength. "She is not the enemy here. She never was. You are." I. He stared at her as if she had physically slapped him. The ultimate betrayal in his mind was not his cruelty to me, but her sudden defiance of him. He scoffed, a bitter, ugly sound. Fine. You two broken women deserve each other. He snatched his coat from the back of his chair and, without another glance, stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The meeting dissolved quickly after that, the other tenants murmuring as they filed out, leaving Laura and me alone in the silent room. Tears were now streaming freely down her face. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice choked with sobs. "About the building, about any of it. Mom, why didn't you tell me?" I looked at my daughter, this stranger who wore her face, and felt a wave of profound sadness, but not pity. "Because this was something you had to see for yourself, Laura," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "You couldn't be told who he was. You had to watch him become it." I didn't reach for her. I didn't offer a hug or wipe away her tears. I simply turned and walked away, leaving her to stand alone in the wreckage of the life she had chosen. 4 days later, she appeared at my door. She was holding a familiar, cloth-bound book in her hands, my mother's diary. "I found it," she said, her voice raw. "It was in a box of your old things I took when you sold the house. I read it, Mom. I know everything." She knew about Arthur Prescott, the secret, the inheritance. This time, when she apologized, it was not just the panicked plea of a cornered animal. It was a deep, gut-wrenching confession of her own weakness, of her complicity, of the shame she felt for allowing Mark's poison to corrupt her. We talked for hours, the first honest conversation we'd had in years. And just before she left, she looked me in the eye and delivered the words that were the true beginning of the end. "I left him," she said. "He came back the next day, and I told him it was over. I changed the locks." In that moment, watching the genuine strength flicker back to life in my daughter's eyes, I felt the last glacier of ice around my heart finally begin to melt. Mark made one last, desperate attempt to regain control. An email arrived, frantic and filled with threats to go to the press with the scandalous story of my birth. He thought shame was still a weapon he could use against me, but I was no longer afraid of the shadows. I simply forwarded his email to Mr. Abrams. The next day, Mark was served with a cease and desist letter that meticulously documented his campaign of harassment and threatened a lawsuit that would ruin him financially and professionally. He disappeared after that. He didn't just leave town. He vanished from our lives like a bad dream, a coward until the very end. With him gone, Laura began to breathe again. She moved into a small, sunlit studio apartment near her job and started taking a pottery class on the weekends, something she'd always wanted to do. She sent me a picture of her first creation, a lopsided but beautiful little bowl. We started talking more, our conversations rebuilding a bridge, not back to what we were, but towards something new, built on a foundation of difficult truths. In the late spring, I sold the building. The day the paperwork was signed was bright and clear. There was no fanfare, just the quiet click of a pen and the feeling of a heavy weight finally lifting from my shoulders. It had been a tool for justice, and its purpose was now fulfilled. I took half of the profits and made a substantial donation to a citywide network of shelters for women and children in crisis, the kind of place I wished I had known about on that cold November night. My only request was that they use a part of the funds to build a new library in their main facility and call it the Evelyn Wing, honoring the quiet woman whose secret love had become my salvation. The rest of the money I used to buy a small, charming house on a quiet street, with a garden out back waiting for me to bring it back to life. Laura helped me unpack. We didn't talk about Mark or the past. We just worked, and for the first time in years, we laughed a real, genuine laugh when I nearly dropped a box of plates. That night, after she left, I sat on my new porch swing, a cup of tea growing cold in my hands. And I finally realized, The most important act of forgiveness wasn't for her, but for myself. Forever believing my worth was something that could be given or taken away by someone else. They tried to teach me that my silence meant I was weak, but I learned how to turn silence into strength. They tried to erase me, and instead, I became someone they could never possibly forget. I was never the raging fire they tried to extinguish. I was the spark they underestimated. Thank you for listening. The journey from pain back to yourself can be a lonely one, but you are never truly alone. If my story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to the channel for more stories of resilience and renewal. And please, feel free to share a part of your own story in the comments below. Your voice matters, and your story deserves to be heard.